The very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society. And we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. We decided long ago that the dangers of excessive and unwarranted concealment of pertinent facts far outweighed the dangers which are cited to justify it.
Good morning, this is Dane Wigington with geoengineeringwatch.org radio, the Global Alert commercial-free news hour for September 26, 2015. Another week in the asylum goes by. We have a list of CNN quote headlines, which I'll read through in a minute, and let's compare those headlines with what's really going on around the globe that we're not told about. I want to cover a few of the major issues, and one is I want to use as an example, and I'll go into this in considerable detail later in this show shortly, is the nuclear cataclysm that is unfolding still in Fukushima that so many around the globe, especially in the U.S., have absolutely no clue about. A cataclysm that's so immense in scope and scale already, with no end in sight, that we're already seeing, and I'll get to this report later as well, deformed sea creatures showing up on the U.S. West Coast, the creatures that are still left alive, because we have mass die-off occurring on the U.S. West Coast now as well. In general with the weather, and again I focus on the weather a lot because I feel mathematically, rationally, if all the data is examined, the greatest threat to each and every one of us, short of nuclear cataclysm, which we have happening now as well, is climate engineering, because you can't escape it. You can't walk out your door and take a breath without inhaling what the climate engineers are spraying. So yes, we face a lot of threats, but nothing can match that threat that's systematically decimating the entire web of life. How long can you hold your breath? So yes, the climate engineers continue to wreak havoc around the globe. The weather whiplash will continue as the U.S. and around the globe, the climate engineering programs are ramped up to ever larger levels. We're going to see radical temperature swings that will continue. These radically warm temperatures to a very short, brief, intense cool-off as they chemically ice nucleate material going further into winter. I'll talk about that more later as well. And we see the really immense amount of anthropogenic damage to the planet. A lot of people I know don't want to believe that. A lot of people want to believe that it's okay to loot, plunder, and pillage the planet forever and nothing will ever go wrong. That's not reality. It's simply not reality. And the greatest form of damage, the greatest single form, the most glaring red flag of human assault against the planet ever launched, mathematically, is climate engineering, if we look at all the angles of decimations caused by that. What's the scheduled weather for the U.S. winter? And I say scheduled, again, because we have Lockheed Martin doing the weather, private defense contractor and geoengineering participant, Lockheed Martin, doing the weather modeling for the FAA. We have Raytheon, private defense contractor, up to their neck in weather modification, doing the weather modeling for National Weather Service and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. You have the Foxes running the hen house. So what's the scheduled weather for this winter? Right now, it appears that what is planned is a cooler than normal southern U.S. in spite of far above normal temperatures completely surrounding this region. From the northern tier, a band across the northern U.S., predicted to be far above normal temperatures, far above normal ocean temperatures. The west is scheduled to be far above normal. The Atlantic Ocean's above normal. How do you have a cold zone in the middle? Because that's where much of the El Nino moisture will be steered, diverted, and ice nucleated. We'll probably see a lot of ice storms this winter. Why is there an ice storm every time we have a quote-unquote winter storm? As we saw last winter, we had the paid meteorologist disinformation actors, which is what they are in the Weather Channel, and sources like that. All of those agencies, again, owned by the corporate power structure, Bain Capital, Rothschilds, and so on. Monsanto, another one. we have them explaining to us why there's a warm side and a cold side to a winter storm. Since when is there a warm side and a cold side to a winter storm? Since geoengineering entered the picture. They need the moisture to chemically ice nucleate. It's part of the process. So we see now typically thunderstorms and warm temperatures on one side of a quote winter storm. Then we'll have an ice band in the middle, ice storm, and then we'll have the winter storm side, the cold side, as the chemical ice nucleation process takes hold. These are unprecedented conditions, and now they're the norm. I hope everybody listening will take the time to search online engineered snowstorms. See what you find. China's Weather Modification Bureau openly announced they were doing this until they did $1 billion worth of damage to Beijing. This is going on. It's real. It's now. So while all this is going on and approaching us, we have Fukushima, we have cataclysms on too many fronts to name, we have massive refugee crises that are, these refugees, which are real, by the way, and many of these refugees are climate related. Their countries have been droughted out by NATO, the infrastructure bombed out. It's not like the refugees aren't real refugees. They are, certainly. But they're being used and manipulated like everything else on the planet's being manipulated by those in power. So with all these things going on, what did CNN cover this week? Let's use them for an example of the corporate media because they all pretty much cover the same thing. These are headlines from this week with CNN. The Democrats say, let Boehner shut it down. Political theater. The budget thing. Again, any ploy they can use to distract the American populace has been quite effective in recent decades, unfortunately. Another headline from CNN, Texas coach quits after referee hit. That's got to be important. Let's go to another one. Russia digs up Tsar's last body. How exactly does that impact the rest of us? The next headline's a little more important. Caterpillar to cut more than 10,000 jobs. Wow, I thought the economy was getting better, as we've been told. Lies on every side. Again, the card house is starting to come down. Back to the unimportant headlines. Bodies found in famous church. Just want to read through a few of these from CNN so we see what are they covering compared to what they're not covering. North Korean defector changes mind. Who cares? Is this the best CNN can do? 36-year-old cold case solved. Where does that fit into the bigger picture? Donald Trump versus the Pope. Trump's lead sinks. Trump slams rival just as a kid. You know, this political theater is beyond ludicrous. Absolutely beyond ludicrous. A couple more headlines from CNN. Want an iPhone 6S? Shop around first. Let's see, we have sluggers fallback job. Major League Baseball sluggers fallback job. Porn star. Who the hell cares? This is the kind of stuff we see on CNN, while at the same time, they're not telling us things like, here's a recent title from last week we didn't see on corporate media at all. Melting permafrost could cost world economy $43 trillion. You think that one would have been somewhere front and center. And even that figure, 43 trillion, it doesn't mean anything. Because if all the frozen deposits of methane melt on the planet, we're done. We're long gone. And that's a mathematical fact. And those who don't believe it will soon. Nighttime low temperatures around the globe are rising twice as fast as daytime high temperatures. That is indicative of methane filling the atmosphere, along with CO2 and other greenhouse gases. But methane is truly the linchpin because there's so much methane hydrate and clathrate frozen deposits around the globe that are thawing, releasing, and entering the atmosphere. As this happens, it's like covering the planet with a layer of glass. So the nighttime low temperatures, again, rising twice as fast as daytime highs. And the ramifications are beyond what most want to even begin to consider. So when we see a figure like it could cost $43 trillion, it's a completely meaningless figure. If significant amounts of this methane again enter the atmosphere, that's the end of the road. You can't pay your way out of that. You can't print your way out of that with the central banks. Can't do it. And right now, again, the only true wealth is natural resources. Money is not wealth. Money is an illusion, a facade. And as the resources are stripped from the planet, and they've been stripped at blinding speed and contaminated, and I'll get to that in a moment with Fukushima, which is a problem of unimaginable proportion and growing by the day. As the natural environment can't support life, it's game over. That's a very simple equation. And climate engineering is fueling that process, probably faster than all other aspects combined, and that's saying a lot. And just for a moment, what are those other aspects that too many people in our population want to ignore? They want to convince themselves that the human race hasn't done any damage to the planet and that the current paradigm can go on forever. But stand back and take a rational look through a clear lens. We have absolutely sacked the planet, and those who think otherwise are simply in denial. We've destroyed over half the trees on the planet. The other half is doing very poorly. They're dying by the day, as I've covered in other shows. We've paved much of the planet. We have decimated the oceans. Where would I stop? We're putting 100 million tons of CO2 in the atmosphere a day, and now that's by burning 4 billion gallons, billion with a B, of hydrocarbon. 36 billion tons of CO2 a year on top of the methane, which I just mentioned. Again, from every direction, we have absolutely decimated the planet. But climate engineering, again, one of the single greatest factors because it affects virtually everything in the web of life. But I want to look at the nuclear situation now and focus on, again, as an example, the type of story that we are not told about, never even mentioned from corporate media anymore. And so much of the world's population believes that problem is fixed, which, again, couldn't be further from the truth. In regard to Fukushima, a recent headline this week is this from E-News, Energy News. Mutations found in sea life along the U.S. West Coast. Deformed spines, brains, hearts, eyes reported by officials. Malformations include extra brain lobes, hunchbacks, parts of faces missing, unusual limbs. You think that would be of some concern, wouldn't you? But no, we're hearing about the former Major League Baseball star that does porn movies on the side. People need to wake up, and that wake up will be forced soon enough. There is inarguably a criminal collaboration between institutions like the World Health Organization, the WHO, and the Atomic Energy Association. There is such collaboration throughout the system. The system is a cancer from top to bottom, and we will all be the victims very soon if we do not wake up and change course. Looking closer at the IAEA and the World Health Organization, two entities that are joined at the hip, totally conflicting interests, but joined at the hip. The World Health Organization was captured or taken over on issues of radioactivity and nuclear power very early on by the IAEA. In 1959, the IAEA and the World Health Organization, also established by the United Nations, by the way, entered into an agreement, one that continues to this day, providing that the IAEA and the WHO, according to a former WHO insider and former WHO employee, Alison Katz, that they act in close cooperation with each other. Again, complete conflict of interest. The Atomic Energy Association and the World Health Association. There should be a huge firewall between those entities. But in fact, there's a revolving door. Another quote from this former WHO insider, Alison Katz. She says, quote, "Whenever either organization proposes to initiate a program or activity on a subject in which the other organization has or may have a substantial interest, the first party shall consult the other with a view to adjusting the matter by mutual agreement." How much deeper collusion could we have? No wonder we don't hear about Fukushima, because the Atomic Energy Association doesn't want us to hear about that, because they have 60 more nuclear plants on the board. News of Fukushima is very bad for business. And we all know the foxes run the hen house from the bottom to the top. But you can't hide from this type of contamination. You can't. The insider from WHO, Alison Katz, continues. She says, WHO cannot undertake any research, cannot disseminate any information, cannot come to the assistance of any population without the prior approval of the IAEA. Think about that. The World Health Organization is not allowed to do anything that has anything to do with populations, radiation exposure, radiation poisoning, unless the Atomic Energy Commission gives them permission to do so. How massive a conflict of interest could that be? We have U.S. military personnel on one of the U.S. carriers that were exposed to radical levels of Fukushima radiation. It appears they were part of an experiment. That ship was in a known contaminated zone and it stayed there. And available data indicates those military personnel were not allowed to leave that ship when it reached the U.S. again without their commitment to confidentiality. What kind of military does this to their own soldiers? And I've talked before about the depleted uranium, Gulf War syndrome, the highly toxic ammunition that some genius at the Pentagon came up with. It's a great projectile as long as you don't care about a permanently contaminated planet when you're done. This was used. Our military men were not told. They spent time in these contaminated areas, and they were permanently damaged. And we're talking about a couple 100,000 of them. Look up depleted uranium. Watch a film called Hidden Wars of Desert Storm. Again, what our media does not tell us. While they're waving flags and talking about patriotism, oh, by the way, we use highly toxic ammunition, which is killing our own troops. How patriotic is that? And I mentioned before in the past, I bought from my own pocket 2 cases, 200 commercial VHS tape copies of that internationally award-winning documentary called Hidden Wars of Desert Storm. And I passed them out on the Diesel Horse Bridge in Reading the night before the second Gulf War. I passed out 200 commercial tapes at my own expense and was photographed by undercover operatives of some sort, Homeland Security, I don't know who they were, photographed as if I was a threat for passing out an internationally award-winning documentary that highlighted the fact that our own troops were poisoned by our own military with depleted uranium and they're not getting help. Is it not patriotic to try to help our troops? Putting a little sticker on your car saying support the troops is pretty cowardly if that's all you do. I was trying to do something real. And I volunteered to rehab NAM vets in the past. I've stated that on air before. I've given to DAV and VFW. I care about our military people, but I simply want them to wake up to what they're being used for and how brutally they're being abused. So back to the IAEA and the World Health Organization, who are joined at the hip. The quote from this insider, Alison Katz, continues, the WHO, in practice, in reality, is subservient to the IAEA within the United Nations family. Think about that. After Fukushima, the quote-unquote safe levels of radiation, the figure for what is a safe level, there is no safe level of radiation, by the way, but the former figure was raised 10,000%. 10,000%. If anybody thinks these agencies exist for the common good, you need to wake up. This insider continues on nuclear issues, quote, there has been a very high level, institutional and international cover-up, which includes governments, national authorities, but also, regrettably, the World Health Organization. No, this is a statement from the World Nuclear Association in regard to Fukushima. Now think about this. Their statement is no deaths, no health damage in relation to Fukushima. Do you believe that? Does anybody in their right mind believe there was no deaths or no health damage from Fukushima? We're seeing thousands of miles away on the West Coast deformed marine life. We are living in a truly corrupt insane asylum, and we will all pay the price soon if there's not a very big wake-up on a great many fronts. So again, while CNN is showing us the Major League Baseball player that does porn on the side, this is what they're not telling us about. There's a series of articles on a reputable website, Global Research. It's called the Online Interactive Reader Series. And I want to read an excerpt from one of these installments on Fukushima. Fukushima, a nuclear war without a war. The unspoken crisis of worldwide nuclear radiation. This is by Michael Chossudovsky. He's done a great deal of good for the overall picture, and I salute his work. Regarding Fukushima, the world is at a critical crossroad. The Fukushima disaster in Japan has brought to the forefront the dangers of worldwide nuclear radiation. Again, we're building 60 more plants at this time. Obama just approved $6.5 billion for 2 more nuclear plants in Georgia, even though Fukushima may kill us all. Continuing, the crisis in Japan has been described as, quote, a nuclear war without a war, in the words of renowned novelist Haruki Murakami. A quote from him, "This time, no one dropped a bomb on us, Japan. We set the stage. We committed the crime with our own hands. We are destroying our own lands, and we are destroying our own lives." Directly from Japanese novelist I just mentioned. Nuclear radiation, which threatens life on planet Earth, is not front page news in comparison to the most insignificant issues of public concern, including local level crime scenes, the tabloid gossip, as I mentioned, reports on Hollywood celebrities, etc. While the long-term repercussions of Fukushima Daiichi nuclear disaster are yet to be fully assessed, they are far more serious than those pertaining to the 1986 Chernobyl disaster. How many people understand that? Fukushima is far more serious. The Russians, at great cost to human life, managed to put the Chernobyl meltdown in a sarcophagus early on. My wife's father, my wife is from Lithuania, and her father was called for this endeavor of spending human life to try to contain this nuclear disaster. I know a bit about this issue. So, continuing, again, Fukushima, greater than the Chernobyl disaster in Ukraine, resulted in almost 1 million deaths. How many people understand that? Chernobyl death toll officially 985,000 from the best available figures, mostly from cancer. Now, continuing on, while all eyes were riveted on the Fukushima Daiichi plant, news coverage both in Japan and internationally failed to acknowledge the impact of a second catastrophe at TEPCO's, that's the Tokyo Electric Power Company, a second disaster at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant. Another plant. The shaky political consensus, both in Japan and the US and Western Europe, is that the crisis at Fukushima has been contained. The realities, however, are otherwise. Fukushima 3 was leaking unconfirmed amounts of plutonium. This is according to Dr. Helen Caldicott, a recognized international expert on the nuclear issue. And she says, quote, 1/millionth of a gram of plutonium, if inhaled, can cause cancer. Most people do not understand how deadly radioactive material is and how little of it takes to permanently compromise your health and or cause mortality. An opinion poll in May 2011 confirmed that more than 80% of the Japanese population do not believe the government's information regarding the nuclear crisis. Why would they? There's one thing we know about governments, one thing we can say for certain, is they lie and lie and lie. In fact, it would be easier to find an instance where they told the truth. And yet, how many people do we have that no matter what happens, they feel this compulsion to blindly support a completely corrupt government, no matter what's done to them? When does the wake-up occur? It's going to occur one way or the other soon because we are in uncharted waters from many directions, uncharted waters. What are the impacts in Japan? The Japanese government has been obliged to acknowledge that the severity rating of its nuclear crisis matches that of the 1986 Chernobyl disaster. This is what the government has acknowledged. In actuality, it's far worse. But how many Americans even know that headline? None, because we're watching the headlines I mentioned earlier. The irony is this. Again, even this admission by the Japanese government is really just another form of cover-up. And people think by such an admission, well, they must be telling the truth now. That is not the case. Admitting that the Japanese disaster, Fukushima disaster, was as bad as Chernobyl was a way to try to cover up the fact that a significantly larger catastrophe, resulting in a process of global nuclear radiation and contamination, was completely underway. A quote from one of the earlier stories on this issue: while Chernobyl was an enormous and unprecedented disaster, it only occurred at one reactor and rapidly melted down. Once cooled, it was able to be covered with a concrete sarcophagus, as I mentioned earlier, that was constructed with 100,000 workers. There are staggering 4,400 tons of nuclear fuel rods at Fukushima, which greatly dwarfs the total size of radiation sources at Chernobyl. Fukushima is far, far worse than Chernobyl. How many people know or understand that? Almost none. Worldwide contamination has already occurred. The west coast of the United States and in the eastern Pacific, much of that radiation is migrating to those regions. And again, we're seeing mass die-off in the eastern Pacific, and Fukushima is a factor. But other factors are in play as well, as I've named earlier. We have climate engineering that has shredded the ozone layer, which has released massive amounts of UV radiation. Most can feel how hot the sun feels on your skin. Inside your car, the thermal energy buildup is immense. The radiation that's now being released on the planet is off the scale. So that's killing plankton. That drops the bottom out of the food chain. Yes, we have the Fukushima contamination on top of all that, but we also have a stratified ocean that's not mixing properly because geoengineering is altering upper level wind currents. That alters ocean currents. We have simply a giant circus, a free-for-all of very damaging elements that are all coming into play at once. So the dumping of highly radioactive water into the Pacific Ocean constitutes a potential trigger to a process of global radioactive contamination. As I mentioned, radioactive elements have not only been detected in the food chain in Japan, radioactive rainwater has been recorded in California by multiple tests. In fact, food, some of the crop harvests have been tested for radiation and showing positive results. A number of food fish, tuna off the coast of California going back now several years were tested and already showing radiation. Official reports have stated hazardous radioactive elements being released in the sea and air around Fukushima accumulate at each step of various food chains. For example, algae, crustaceans, small fish, bigger fish than humans. It goes right up the food chain and it accumulates along the way. It's important to understand as you move to each larger organism, the amount of contamination builds exponentially. This is the same with mercury, for example. Many people understand this, that the larger the fish you eat, the more contaminated it is with mercury, as if we need something else in the equation right now. I mean, we live in a toxic soup. We've turned our planet into a toxic wasteland already, and it's going to get worse fast. But the same is true with the radiation. The farther you go up the food chain, the greater the contamination grows. So by the time it's entering the human body, these elements, called eternal emitters, migrate to specific organs such as the thyroid, the liver, bones, the brain, continuously irradiating small volumes of cells with high doses of alpha, beta, and gamma radiation. Over many years, this will induce cancer. While the spread of radiation to the west coast of North America was casually acknowledged the early press reports, AP and Reuters, quoting diplomatic sources, stated that only, quote, tiny amounts of radioactive particles have arrived in California, but do not pose a threat to human health. What a blatant, glaring lie. What an absolute blatant, glaring lie, like the blatant, glaring lie that we are just seeing condensation in our skies. The iPhones need to be dumped, and the sports games and the golf games and the soccer games. And I know nobody wants to hear what I have to say about that. Nobody wants to hear that the party is coming to an end, like it or not. We can, while we're all knee-deep on the deck of the Titanic right now, we can do some good still, a lot of good. But not while we're distracted with everything else under the sun. Not while we're watching the Major League Baseball player that does what he does on the side, as I mentioned earlier. We're not going to accomplish anything for the common good if that's where we spend our time. If we care about our children, if we want them to have a future, it matters that we find out what's going on around us. We owe this to them. We owe this to our children. Find out what's going on and help wake others up. So again, while we're told by mainstream media sources, who lie to us, by the way, that's the whole purpose of this news program, which this is not a job I wanted, any of this, to fight against geoengineering or to expose this truth. This is simply something that has to be done. So that's why we have a commercial-free news hour, airtime that is not censored or dictated by anyone. So back to what we're told by mainstream media again, that this radiation is not harmful. Mainstream media, Reuters, continue to state, according to the news agencies, the unnamed sources, how convenient, have access to data from a network of measuring stations run by the United Nations, back to the foxes running the hen house, Comprehensive Test Ban Organization. Greg Jaczko, chair of the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission, told White House reporters that his experts, quote, don't see any concern from radiation levels that could be harmful here in the United States or any of the U.S. territories. How convenient. Everything's fine. Go back to sleep. Go back to shopping. What did we hear from George Bush after 9/11? Go back to shopping in the malls. It's exactly what we heard. What do we hear from Obama? Same thing. They don't want you to look. They don't want you to investigate anything. They don't want you to investigate 9/11. They don't want you to investigate Fukushima. And they sure don't want you to investigate what's going on above your head every day with the massive aerosol assault that is so incredibly easy to see. So many people don't even recognize what a real cloud looks like anymore because they've been exposed to this so long. Wake up. Look around you. On Fukushima, I want to finish with this issue because it's such a glaring example of what we're not being told. What prevails in this story is a well-organized camouflage. The public health disaster in Japan, the contamination of water, agriculture, land, entire food chain, not to mention the broader economic and social implications, have not been fully acknowledged or addressed in any comprehensive and meaningful fashion by the Japanese authorities or the U.S. government. Japan as a nation state has, for all practical purposes, been destroyed. It's in the process of this destruction right now. Its landmass and territorial waters are contaminated. Part of the country is uninhabitable. High levels of radiation have been recorded in the Tokyo metropolitan area, which has a population of 39 million as of 2010, more than the population of Canada, which is 34 million, by the way. There are indications that the food chain is contaminated throughout Japan. This is not a localized issue. You can't contain this kind of contamination. Radioactive cesium exceeding the legal limit was detected in tea in a factory in Suzuko City, more than 300 kilometers away from the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant. This prefecture is one of the most famous tea-producing areas in Japan. A tea distributor in Tokyo reported to the prefecture that it detected high levels of radioactivity in the tea shipped from the city. This prefecture ordered the factory to refrain from shipping out the product. After the accident at Fukushima nuclear power plant, radioactive contamination of tea leaves and processed tea has been found over a wide area around Tokyo. More than 5 companies have detected this radiation. Japan's industrial manufacturing base is also highly affected. Japan is no longer a leading industrial power in many ways. The country exports have plummeted. The Tokyo government has announced its first trade deficit since 1980. Again, those who think that the economy is recovering anywhere in the world are living in an illusion. It's always been a card house, kept afloat by printed central bank money, but the card house is collapsing already. If you don't believe me, you will. While the business media has narrowly centered on the impacts of power outages and energy shortages on the pace of productive activity, the broader issue pertaining to the outright radioactivity contamination of the country's infrastructure and industrial base is a scientific taboo. It's not discussed. The Japanese culture is very, very stern in this sense that certain things that are not comfortable to address are not addressed. In fact, it's the same here. How many people refuse to look at data on anything that's uncomfortable to them because it feels a lot better remaining in denial to them? So what's been contaminated? Industrial plants, machinery, equipment, buildings, roads. A report released in 2012 points to the nuclear contamination of building materials used in the construction industry, including roads, residential buildings, all throughout Japan. Now, again, how much of this have we heard from our media? How about exactly nothing? And we have this contamination spreading throughout the globe right now. Fukushima is a nuclear volcano with no end in sight. There is no technology to fix Fukushima. We have 3 reactors in total meltdown. This is China syndrome. There is virtually no end to this crisis in sight, and they're building 60 more around the globe. People ask, as they so often do, and this is one of the forms in which people remain in denial, they, the proverbial they, would never do this to themselves. Well, who are the proverbial they? Back to the central bankers. And how much have they done, and are they continuing to do to themselves? They're not leaving this planet. And yet, even when we have Fukushima, not only are we not told about Fukushima, not only is there nothing that can be done about Fukushima, but they're building 60 more right now. Keep that in mind. A cover-up report by the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, entitled Economic Impact of the Great East Japan Earthquake and Current Status of Recovery, that's the name of the report, presents the economic recovery as a reality. It also brushes aside the issue of radiation. Such reports are designed to pacify the public, to put them back to sleep, to take their eye off what's really happening, things that can't be fixed, and they're getting worse by the day. The impacts of nuclear radiation on the workforce in Japan and the country's industrial base are not mentioned. Just like our unemployment figure here in the U.S. Why did the unemployment figure get better? How can that be? Because every time they report, 200,000 or 300,000 people just fell off the back end of the conveyor. They no longer count. They're no longer a part of the equation. They're not part of the math. It's a total illusion. So while we have empty stores all over, Northern California, it's certainly the case here, we have forests dying, we have atrocities in our skies, all the quote-unquote officials tell us it's all normal, it's all fine. Go to a movie, get a Big Mac. This is the Orwellian state we live in. So this report, again, pacifying the Japanese population, states also that the distance between Tokyo and Fukushima Daiichi is in the order of 230 kilometers, about 144 miles, and that the levels of radiation in Tokyo are lower than in Hong Kong and New York City. Now, you can draw two conclusions from that. They're obviously either lying about the radiation levels in Tokyo, or the radiation levels are damn high in Hong Kong and New York City. They state the impact of the Great East Japan earthquake and current status of recovery is all heading in the right direction. This report is made without corroborating evidence in an overt contradiction with independent radiation readings in Tokyo, i.e., the lying that I spoke about earlier, the quote-unquote safe levels of radiation that were raised 10,000% after Fukushima to make the safe level appear acceptable to the population, when in reality the radiation levels were anything but safe, and they're growing by the day. Again, there is no end in sight. There are spent fuel rod storage pools in some of the Fukushima facilities that, if they are triggered into further meltdown, would literally hold all life on Earth in the balance. The fundamental question is whether the vast array of industrial goods and components, quote, made in Japan, including high-tech components, machinery, electronics, motor vehicles, etc., and exported worldwide, are they contaminated? Were this to be the case, the entire East and Southeast Asian industry base, which depends heavily on Japanese components and industrial technology, would be affected. The potential impacts on international trade would be far-reaching. Again, the monetary influence here is huge. That's why there's so much lying. The primary purpose of those in power is to keep the machine moving forward, no matter how much lying you have to do, no matter how much people have to be exposed to, how much contamination. It doesn't matter what gets in their way. Their goal is to keep the juggernaut of insanity moving forward. So again, the potential impacts on international trade would be far-reaching if this contamination was known. In this regard, in January, Russian officials confiscated irradiated Japanese automobiles, along with auto parts, in the port of Vladivostok in Russia for sale in the Russian Federation. Needless to say, incidents of this nature on a global competitive environment could lead to the demise of the Japanese automobile industry, which is already in crisis. While most of the automotive industry is in central Japan, Nissan's engine factory is 42 kilometers from Fukushima. Is the Nissan workforce affected? How could they not be affected? And again, there's every effort to cover up the scope and scale of the nuclear cataclysm in Fukushima. Is this engine plant contaminated? The plant is within 10 to 20 kilometers of the government's evacuation zone, from which some 200,000 people were evacuated. The crisis in Japan has also brought into the open the unspoken relationship between nuclear energy and nuclear war. Many people don't consider this. Nuclear energy is not a civilian economic activity. It's an appendage of the nuclear weapons industry, which is controlled by the so-called defense contractors. The powerful corporate interests behind nuclear energy and nuclear weapons overlap, just like what we covered earlier. The World Health Organization and the Atomic Energy Association joined at the hip. All of these major components of the structure of civilization are all part of the cancer. They're all connected. So while the population goes about its business thinking someone, somewhere, is keeping an eye on things, someone, somewhere, would tell us if the ship has a hole in the bottom and we're sinking. That couldn't be further from the truth. The whole system has been designed from top to bottom to hide the problems, not to disclose them. And the money all leads back to the central banks. How are these organizations controlled? Even state organizations and even county organizations? And they're all controlled. Go right back up the chain and follow it all the way to the central banks. Where does California's $50 or $60 billion yearly budget deficit go? Where did last year's deficit go? And the year before? Does anybody even talk about this? how much of the entire structure we know, our entire governmental and societal structure, is being kept afloat by the illusion of printed money. The stock market, which is a snake eating its own tail, the blocking of critical health information from the public that we know is going on. I personally know it's going on because I've been in meetings and told by the quote-unquote official government experts that they are told not to disclose the whole truth. High-level EPA meeting in Sacramento, 5 top EPA people told to my face, closed-door meeting arranged by a congressional rep, told to my face that they are told to test for combustion particulates only. And the rest of their air samples go out the window. And we know that they are only testing for PM10 or PM2.5, 10 or 2.5 microns, particles exponentially larger than, for example, the climate engineering fallout. So all of it goes virtually undetected. Just like this radiation is going undetected. Why? Because the quote-unquote safe level is 10,000 times higher than it was, and there is no safe level of radiation. The entire system is designed to hide the gravity of what's unfolding from the public. People need to understand that. So as we have, again, the defense contractors and the atomic energy people connected at the hip, and we know World Health Organization is connected at the hip, you start to see that the whole cancer is all part and parcel of the same beast. It's all connected. And all the individual cancer cells, people, some of them that you and I know, who are part of this system, but are willing to do whatever they're told because it's, quote, their job, because it gives a paycheck and a pension. And that's simply not okay. It's not okay. We need to point out to these people that once society wakes up to what's going on, and they're waking up, that such people will be held accountable for their part in the crimes of omnicide on planet Earth. For those that don't know what omnicide is, it's a destruction of all life. Not just ecocide, not just genocide, but omnicide. In Japan, at the height of the disaster, the nuclear industry and government agencies were scrambling to prevent the discovery of atomic bomb research facilities hidden in Japan's civilian nuclear power plants. That's from a report, again, from Global Research, secret weapons program inside Fukushima nuclear plant. So while our political theater of actors keeps pointing the finger at Iran, nothing is mentioned about the massive nuclear arsenal the U.S. holds, and countries like Israel that has about 200 nuclear weapons, and Japan, who's not supposed to have anything to do with nuclear weapons, but yet reports indicate they in fact did. We are not being told anything like this from mainstream media. Nothing. And again, Fukushima is a glaring example of the omission of dire truths that are affecting all of us here, right now. The nuclear buildup is happening. It's been measured in dairy products, produce, fish off the coast. It's real. It's here. It's now. And it will affect you. It is affecting you. It should be considered that the complacency of the media and governments to the hazards of nuclear radiation pertains to the nuclear energy as well as to the use of nuclear weapons. In both cases, the devastating health impacts of nuclear radiation are casually denied. Think about that. Again, the Atomic Energy Commission stating that there is no health or environmental dangers from Fukushima. People should be able to see through that kind of absolute lie. Tactical nuclear weapons with explosive capacity of up to 6 times a Hiroshima bomb are labeled by the Pentagon as, quote, safe for the surrounding civilian population. Think about that. Nuclear weapons 6 times more powerful than Hiroshima are labeled by the Pentagon as safe. We are all being herded over the cliffs in too many ways to count. The wake-up needs to occur soon. No concern has been expressed at the political level as to the likely consequences of a U.S. NATO-Israel attack on Iran. Not much talk about that, is there? using, quote, safe for civilians nuclear weapons against a non-nuclear state. Now, whatever you think about Iran, and I'm not saying that there's not problems in the Middle East or there's not radicalism. I'm not saying that. Of course there is. As we talked about last week on the show, who's fueling some of these terrorist groups? And we can lead it right back to Western powers, right back to John McCain standing with the leaders of ISIS. If you don't believe me, look it up. Look it up. They need that kind of threat to manipulate the population here, and it's worked quite well. It's worked quite well. So people ignore what their own government is doing to them and focus only on the distraction that their government has helped to fuel. And again, I'm not saying that the religious fundamentalists don't exist. They do. But who's arming them? Who helped to spawn them? Who's fueling them? In the case of Iran, as I've stated before, in 230 years, Iran has invaded exactly no one. In 230 years, the U.S. has invaded and or occupied 70 countries. We have boots on the ground in 156 countries. How many foreign countries have bases in our country? How many? I'm only asking. I'm asking the question. It's not about condoning, again, some of the governmental structures we have overseas, but why is Saudi Arabia our friend then? Saudi Arabia, who stones to death any woman who may have been raped, gets stoned to death. And they're our ally. We don't hear anything bad about Saudi Arabia, do we? People need to wake up. The censorship is beyond belief. The bottom line is, as the Pentagon states, that these tactical nuclear weapons are safe for civilian populations. Such an action as nuclear weapons used in Iran, the unthinkable, a nuclear holocaust over a large part of the Middle East and Central Asia, a nuclear nightmare, however, would occur even if nuclear weapons were not used. The bombing of Iran's nuclear facilities using conventional weapons would contribute to unleashing another Fukushima-type disaster with extensive radioactive fallout. We're not told that, are we? Because we're not told about Fukushima. We're not told about the depleted uranium weapons that our military uses, poisoning our own troops. We're not told about climate engineering. And this can only happen by a whole lot of people in the system, quote-unquote, doing their job. I'm going to finish with this on Fukushima. Again, using Fukushima as a glaring example of what we're not being told while CNN feeds us nonsense, irrelevant stories. CNN, MSNBC, Fox, all of them. All of them. They're all just different sides to the same coin. Recent developments at Fukushima, the Fukushima Fishing Cooperative allowed TEPCO, who owns Fukushima, to discharge the contaminated water into the sea. Now, there are hundreds of thousands of tons of nuclear radiated water being dumped into the Pacific right now. TEPCO started discharging the contaminated groundwater to the Pacific on 9/14/2015. This is recent. It was discharged for nearly 6 hours in daytime. The reported volume of contaminated water was 838 tons in that short period, and it's washing out all the time, and we're not being told. The discharged water was pumped from 20 of 41 wells called subdrains situated beside crippled reactor buildings 1 through 4. China syndrome is happening now. For those who are familiar with what China syndrome is, watch the movie. It means when it melts through the reactor container and it starts melting into the earth. It's happening now in 3 reactors. How many people know that? One more sign of problems in Japan, deformed fir trees in Japan. When it starts to mutate the foliage and the fish and the wildlife, it's bad. And it's happening right now. The bottom line is this. We have Fukushima that could exterminate all life on Earth. We have geoengineering going on right now that is tearing apart the web of life. And by the way, geoengineering could cause many more Fukushimas because it's tearing apart the ozone layer. That's Earth's natural protection. If we have a large coronal mass ejection now, a CME, we have grids shut down around the globe. Nuclear plants can't cool themselves. Maybe we have Fukushima times 200 or 300 then. We need to wake up. We all need to get our priorities straight. We're in a fight for life. That's a fact. It's nothing less. Find out what you don't know. Educate yourself, connect the dots, and help others to open their eyes. Help them to connect the dots. We need to wake the sleeping masses from the illusion of the normalcy bias. Normalcy bias meaning if If you think it's all okay because McDonald's is still selling Big Macs and Walmart's open and you can go see a movie, you need to wake up. We don't have much time. If you want your children to have any chance for a future, then fighting for the greater good is not an option, it's an obligation. Make your voice heard in the all-important battle to shatter the cancer of lies, tyranny, and deception. This is Dane Wigington with geoengineeringwatch.org and Global Alert News. Until next week, thank you.